Globally, in 2026, it's estimated that the global food system is actually costing us 15 million lives lost every single year.
What is toxic about our food system?
It has taken over. This high meat, high fat, plant deficient, fibre deficient, high junk food, high ultra processed food, it has been designed for profitability, not for human health. Heart disease kills 160,000 people in the UK every year. It costs the NHS £16 billion every single year. So I hope the new Prime Minister listens to your podcast, John, because if the new Prime Minister really wants to make a difference to the health of this country, invest in the NHS, but also take on the challenge of transforming our food system. My take-home message tonight is that the food that we eat every day is actually the most powerful lever that we have to improve our health and the health of future generations here in the UK.
So Alan, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much, John. And what a boring world it would be if we agreed on 100% of everything. So I think in terms of nutrition and science moves forward.
Yep.
I think a dead giveaway for anybody who talks about healthy food and the effect that food has on human health and longevity is if they're still saying right now the exact same thing they were saying 20 years ago, because that means they have a belief that isn't changing with emerging evidence.
100%.
100%. So we need to be ready to admit when we have evolved, when our beliefs have evolved. And I wrote another book back in 2020. This is my second book, What Your Doctor Isn't Telling You About Food. And there are things in the new book that contradict things that were in the old book, but that's because science has moved on.
Yep. And I think that this is still the preamble. But one of the things which, has become frustrating about science is that a lot of scientists do actually get into that ego trap of saying that science is cooked, science is done, scientists think this. And I think that scientism, and we talked about it with James Phillips, who was head of one of the chief scientists for Number 10, saying, it's so frustrating to him, this idea that people say that kind of science is done, we know this, we know that, and it's like the end of history, it's like the end of science, if you see.
I think within nutrition, what we can look at is the current scientific consensus. And I have sat in rooms, I have spoken at conferences. Anyone who's come across my content previously knows that I personally eat an exclusively plant-based diet. And I have sat in rooms with dozens of doctors and dietitians who also eat exclusively a plant-based diet. And we don't agree on everything to do with human nutrition and health, okay? So even in that tight space, there's still room for debate and discussion.
Well, tight space is a brilliant introduction to a gastroenterologist, especially someone that has to invade that tight space often in your profession. And thank you for all the lives that you save in doing so. We're going to start with one of the main points in your book, which is the differentiation between lifespan and health span. I think some people might begin to understand what that is, but the floor's yours, Alan, in terms of explaining your insights there.
Well, this is important. And in many ways, this kind of summarizes the health crisis that we're facing right now in this first quarter of the 21st century. In 1900, just 150 years ago, which really is a blink of an eye in terms of human evolution and history, the average life expectancy for a human was about 31 years. So that was it. That was your time on Earth, 31 years. Is there anyone here in the room who's 31 or younger? Yeah, so you would be the old folks, and everybody else would be dead, on average. Because life expectancy had been capped at that number for a tremendously long time. What changed? Human innovation, science, sanitation, modern medicine, antibiotics. A secure food system made a tremendous difference to human health and longevity. Here we are, 1900 to 2025, and the average life expectancy on Earth is now 73 years. In the UK, for a woman, it's 86 years. If you had told somebody that in 1900, they would not have believed you. They would have thought you were loopy, that you were just making stuff up, but it's a fact. We have extended the time that we get to spend on this Earth by decades, nearly tripled it. But in the first quarter of this 21st century, we are seeing a worrying change. about 1 in 4 people globally is now living with poor metabolic health. In the United States, about 40% of people are living with poor metabolic health. Our lifespans are getting longer, but our health spans, the number of years that we live without chronic disease, without the effects of cancer, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, chronic illness, etc., chronic pain, osteoarthritis, etc., is actually getting shorter. So a moment ago, I told you that the average life expectancy for a woman in the UK is 86. The health span is 20 years shorter than that. So we are spending our final decades, those hard-fought gains that modern medicine and sanitation and antibiotics have won us, are being whittled away. Generation Alpha, so my kids are all of Generation Alpha, they're 15 and younger. So they are heading into a future where their future health is less than certain. In fact, if the current trends are allowed to continue, they'll be the first generation in modern history to have shorter health spans than their parents and grandparents. And that's the difference between lifespan and health span. And as you might guess, guys, food and our food system has a lot to do with this.
What is toxic about our food system? Because this is about how to escape it. So let's just describe the terrain before we describe how to navigate.
So toxic, I guess that isn't a word I use in the book. We used that this evening. Toxic. If I told you that for most of human history, food was something that helped us to get through the day and be the healthiest possible version of ourselves in that particular time in history, you would believe me. Right. In the 21st century, food has become, in high-income countries, is now the number one driver of preventable chronic disease, the number one driver of years of health span lost. Now, we knew that in the UK back in 2010. As far back as 2010, we knew that the standard British diet was causing more illness and healthy years of life lost than smoking, than alcohol, or than illicit drug use, or lack of exercise. It was estimated at that time that it was costing us 1.6 million years of health, our food system, every single year. Globally, in 2026, it's estimated that the global food system, and due to the amount of diet-related diseases that it's driving, is actually costing us about 15 million lives lost every single year through preventable diet-related diseases such as heart disease, cancer, complications of type 2 diabetes, etc., and probably costing us about 190 million years of human health and productivity every single year. So the food is the thing. We get out of bed every morning. We think, what will I eat today? I get out of bed in the morning. First thing I think, maybe second thing I think is, what am I going to have for breakfast today?
What's the first thing that you think?
The first thing I think is, should I have a coffee now or wait till later?
We all know it's 1 hour for our cortisol management.
So the first thing I think is coffee. But then I'm thinking, what am I going to eat today? What am I going to have for lunch? What are we having for dinner? We're all familiar with that question. What should I eat? But in the 21st century, what should I eat is actually one of the most important questions you can ask yourself every day.
I wasn't going to ask this, but we talked about it briefly before we had a very small conversation beforehand, which was fantastic. Thank you for that, Alan. But, as someone trying to run a food business, which is trying to help people eat and live well, some of the problems of that are laid out in my former business partner's book, Ravenous, in his National Health Strategy, one of which is humans, unfortunately, deliver a dopamine response to go after things that used to be scarce in nature. It could be seasonal fruit, it could be offal in animals, we'll debate that later. But it wasn't always the bad stuff wasn't always as readily available as it is now. And that also goes from that dopamine release to porn, from that sort of, we used to meet a woman's eyes across the table or a man's eyes across the table. Looking at your eyes, you're quite handsome. But we used to then imagine going on a date with them, have a chat with them, then go on a date with them. Now, all of that dopamine shortcut is available through pornography. A lot of the dopamine response is available through cocaine. So chocolate, cocaine, arguably, and pornography have shortcutted all of those dopamine responses. Easter eggs used to be for the end of Lent. Now a Cadbury's cream egg is for every day of Lent, and the shops are full of that crap from way before even Lent begins, and now we eat it all the time. Birthday cakes, any excuse, birthday cakes, Easter eggs, always a cake. And I remember going to, there's a question coming. I remember going to my dad's renal ward in Brighton Hospital, and I got up in the lift, and I could smell the hospital smell immediately. And I looked down the corridor, and I was like, oh my God, no wonder they're in a renal ward. Look how unhealthy they are. Look how overweight they are. Look how slow they're moving. It's just so sad to see how slowly they move in hospital. And of course, when I got down the other end, I realized they were the nurses. And their breaks were a tin of Quality Street in the ward, right? And you must see this all the time. Hospital, friends of mine that work in hospital uniform business, like we're always having to make the uniforms bigger and bigger. So my question is, after a ramble, is what do we do when we've got this thing called the pleasure trap? And what do we do when, the cost of the planetary impact isn't costed into food? Because that's all part of the toxicity at a structural level, isn't it?
No, you're right. I mean, we used to call this, there was a time when we referred to the standard American diet.
Yeah.
And we all looked across the pond to the US, and we saw the rates of obesity and heart disease and type 2 diabetes skyrocketing. We saw their waistlines skyrocketing. We saw their medical scrubs getting bigger. And we thought, oh my goodness, the US food system is so terrible. The US food system, the standard American diet, became the standard Western diet. Now it's the standard global diet. It has taken over. This high meat, high fat, plant deficient, fiber deficient, high junk food, high ultra processed food has been completely designed and subsidized and structured. It hasn't happened by accident. It's been put in place. It has been designed for profitability, not for human health. For most of the food industry, although a lot of the food industry will talk the talk about human health, really, of course, what they're really seeking is profitability. So we have endless opportunities to feed ourselves foods that make us less healthy and in really high volumes. And one of the ways that we see it, we've kind of alluded to it once or twice, but let's talk about it openly. One of the ways that we see that laid out very plainly, you've mentioned it, is rising rates of obesity and rising rates of overweight. Now, it is entirely possible to be healthy at any body size or any body weight. But the fact is that if we are carrying extra fat on our body and around our organs, it does increase our risk of many medical problems. Since 1990, in Europe alone, the cost of treating obesity and overweight-related health conditions has increased by a factor of 2.5. Every single human, to some extent, is genetically predisposed to gaining weight. Of course they are. For most of human history, calories were hard to find. Most people were underfed for all of their 31 years or fewer. So in that environment, for generation upon generation, if you were genetically predisposed to absorb calories from food efficiently and to store energy on your body, that made you the that made you the fittest and the strongest person in your neighborhood. And as Charles Darwin told us, if you're the fittest and the strongest, you get to pass on your genes. There are about 180 genes that influence our ability to gain body weight. In the 1960s, if you had the full deck, if you had all of the genes for absorbing energy and storing energy, if you were genetically predisposed to gaining weight, you had about a 1 in 10 chance of living with obesity. By 2000, that had become a 1 in 3 chance. And in 2026, 1/3 of adults and 1/3 of children are living with obesity. Now, did human genetics change during that 60 to 70 year period? Absolutely not. Did people somehow get lazy or greedy or change their attitude to food? Did human culture change? No, of course it didn't. What happened was the food environment changed completely. And the current rates of obesity and overweight, and you described seeing this writ large when you visited the hospital. This isn't due to a human flaw or laziness or personal irresponsibility. This is what happens when you take Stone Age biology and you put it into a food system that is designed for constant overconsumption. This is human biology doing what human biology does. So in my book, What Your Doctor Isn't Telling You About Food, I acknowledge that there are things we can do on an individual basis, and we can rebuild our individual food environment, and we can rebuild our family's food environment, and the ripple effects of that can go out into your community and your neighborhood and to your loved ones. But really, to affect meaningful change, there's 15 conversations about food in the book. As I wrote the book, I thought these are 15 conversations I wish that all doctors could have with their patients. Of course, as I wrapped up the book, it occurred to me, these are 15 conversations we should all be having about food, not just in our homes, in our kitchens, in our hospitals, in our clinics, but also in the rooms where people design the policies and the funding and the subsidies that actually shape our food system and shape our food environment.
So, Alan, in about 30 seconds, I'm going to ask you why most doctors don't know enough about this, and why you do. But just to respond to your sort of genetic point, I mean, one of the early episodes we had was with a guy called Mark Laponis. He was medical director at a place called Canyon Ranch in America. It's a sort of like well-being. It's a place where I won't call it a health farm because it's not. That's a bit 80s. But it's kind of a health farm. And he worked with another doctor called Mark Hyman, who's become somewhat controversial as a sort of functional medicine bias doctor in America. But Mark Hyman was the medical director. He's written a book called The Farmer-Hunter Diet. And in that, his thesis is that traditionally we had a metabolism and a genetics where we were hunters and where we did not need constant carbohydrate because constant carbohydrate before an agrarian revolution was not available. Don't worry, we're not going to talk about meat. But that actually genetically, those people had naturally sufficiently high blood sugar, but that the farmers, and we can decide whether you agree with this in a minute, that the farmers more recently, who for the last 2,000 years have been in agrarian plains in, say, Germany, actually, they've been acclimatized for their bodies to need those carbohydrates to maintain their blood sugar. And his thesis is that those with the genetics of the hunter are now disproportionately likely to put on weight given their genetic profile, because for many generations, they did not need the type of sugar, chocolate, that we are now seeing in the
So can I give you a response that's grounded in my book?
Yeah.
And I love this because we chatted earlier and I thought that we agree on 90%, but there's a few things we don't agree on. And why don't we try and touch on some of those, So what you're speaking about there in many ways actually is related to the whole concept of precision nutrition. Okay, so we have this concept, we have these industries, we have these businesses in the 21st century called precision nutrition companies. And these are really, really interesting. And I love their research and I love their publications and I devour the studies when they're published. So the concept of precision nutrition is based on multi-omic analysis, exactly what you're talking about.
No, I'm not sure.
But let me finish the point.
Because I agree with you that getting to that level of precision, certainly in gut health, is
that level of precision. So what they'll do, and there are various companies, there's one very big UK company, but there's also companies around Europe and the US doing the same thing. So what they'll do is they'll do genetic tests. They'll check your blood sugar response. They might give you a test meal to see what your blood sugar looks like. They'll check your gut microbiome, genetic tests. In fact, there's one European company called Predominant. And in order to go into their process, they do 50 different biomarkers to determine your individual metabolic responses. So it doesn't matter if you were a German farmer or if you were an Inuit local or an Irish man working the fields. They'll find out what your individual metabolism looks like. And then for the Predominant company, they will then group you into one of 5 different metabolic clusters, and they will give you a bespoke nutrition plan specifically for you. Does this sound familiar? Precision nutrition. They tell you how you need to eat for your biology on the assumption that every human is unique. So they did a number of studies showing that this program could help people to get healthier, to lose weight, reverse insulin resistance, reverse high blood pressure, etc. But then they did a really brave study. They got 100 people and they divided them into two groups. Half the group went through the full preventomics, multi-omic analysis, 50 biomarkers, all of the rest of it, given bespoke meal plans. The other 50% got none of that. What they got was a free membership of a healthy, organic, whole food, plant-based meal delivery service. So meals delivered to their home, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, beans, nuts and seeds, chickpea curry, soup with lentils, all that stuff. Whole food, plant-based meals. So at the end of the study, they then looked at which group did better. What was the answer?
I think we know.
There was no difference, John, right? There was no difference in the outcomes between those two different groups. So that sort of puts the lie to that concept that people, due to their genetic history, the food they ate when they were growing up, how their parents ate, how their ancestors ate, it doesn't really matter, actually, because what the science tells us is that broadly, if we can take anybody who's eating a standard Western diet and we can get them to eat more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, and eat more plant-forward meals, it works with their biology, helps them to get a little bit healthier. Now, an interesting postscript to that paper was, because I read that paper at numerous occasions, and on the website for the company, Preventomics, it's a really nice website and very fancy. And it has a lot of details about all the European Union funding they've been getting for that company, which is great because helping to fund amazing research, and how they're going to solve the problem with the food system through Preventomics. The food delivery service that was involved in that study, I found the name of the food delivery service in the supplementary data that was published with the paper, and I looked them up because I wanted to look at the meals, and they'd gone out of business. So where's the funding for them?
So we're not going to go down this rabbit hole, I don't think. But
I love rabbit holes, but let's come back up. Let's come back up.
Let me just a preface for another conversation. I work all the time trying to debunk the overly precise, especially gut health testing, where the result of all of that is eat more vegetables, and we don't know how we can actually affect it. We can observe it. We don't even know how, the microbiome is a quantum thing that's constantly changing. We've taken a moment in time. It might have been different the next day. And now we try and pretend to give you a personalized thing, but all of that advice tends to be just generic, even if some other companies are trying to pretend to make it specific. So I couldn't agree more. What I do think is still interesting is the idea that some people put weight on more easily than others because their natural metabolic profile is a bit of a spectrum. Or what I'm not saying is we can choose any one people there and create absolute personalized, predictable diet for that person. But I do believe that people's insulin sensitivity bias is different for certain genetic types.
Yeah,
and that's something we can debate.
And of course, there are subtle differences between humans. Some people absorb dietary cholesterol more readily. Some people will metabolize caffeine differently. But the idea that every single human needs a very bespoke plan, I think,
100%,
and you know,
100%.
the precision nutrition companies are trying to prove that. Now, I just gave an example of one paper, but there was a recent meta-analysis where they pulled together 9 clinical trials by these precision nutrition companies. And the verdict of the researchers is that when it comes to precision nutrition right now, the hype is outpacing the science. So if you are sitting at home and you're wondering, how can I make my diet healthier? The science suggests that you are better off. If you have the money to spend, and you're thinking, how am I going to spend my money? According to this huge paper, the best way to spend your money is on a healthy plant-based or plant-predominant meal delivery service. But again, back to the problem with the system, We know that in the UK, the system has to change, because for the people who are on the lowest 20% of incomes in the UK with families, in order, never mind a healthy plant-based delivery service, providing them with most of their calories, for those families, they would have to spend 70% of the disposable income just to feed their families the bare minimum of what constitutes a healthy diet. So I hope the new Prime Minister listens to your podcast, John, because if the new Prime Minister really wants to make a difference to the health of this country, which we need, we've got some of the worst health statistics in Europe, invest in the NHS, please invest in healthcare providers, please invest in social care, but also take on the challenge of transforming our food system. A few years ago, there was an independent analysis looking at what difference would it make to the UK if we had a plant-predominant food system. In many ways, going even further than your former colleague Henry Dimbleby's report suggested back in 2021, the National Food Strategy, going even further than that. And if we could make healthy plant-based options available to everyone, not exclusively, but if we could tilt our food environment heavily in that direction here in the UK, it would save the NHS maybe £6 or £7 billion every single year. It would save the UK economy tens of billions of pounds every single year, just by making people healthier and more productive.
Which is also a good outcome as well as money, as you would suggest. So you enjoyed the black bean today in Lyon?
Well, look, I'm going to be honest, okay? When I was invited to come and speak with you tonight, I thought, great, Lyon. I love the black bean brown rice box that they do. So I stopped off for one on the way here. And I was saying to John earlier that when my wife and kids and I come to London, we live down southwest of England, but when we're in London, we always hit up some great plant-based spots. Other times we just do picnics. We just go into the supermarket, we'll get like basic healthy food, or we'll sit out and have a picnic somewhere. But if we're going out for a meal, the kids always want to go to Lyon, and we do. And I will have the black bean brown rice. I used to get the kimchi on the side. I had the broccoli earlier. Yeah. It was delicious. The kids have the love burger, and it's all good.
Well, look, this is like, two different people on the stage here. One of which eats at Lyon, and the other one is fucking in the office eating pizza. Right, so you can probably see that yourselves. So why do most doctors not know anything about nutrition? And also, you get those round robin letters at Christmas. There's always like, Simon has gone to Warwick to study medicine, and I'm like, well, that's a shame, isn't it? Because why doesn't Simon study health? Because actually what Simon is studying is pills and surgery. And often, as we know, I won't mention their name, but, Fibre is one of the biggest funders of a lot of universities. And for some reason, they advocate a lot of their products. I've got no idea why that would be. But not a lot of hospitals or universities are funded by Big Turmeric.
Or Big Broccoli.
Or Big Broccoli, yeah, Big Broccoli. But why do most doctors not know? Is it because they're not taught? They're not interested? The incentives aren't there? What's the reason? And also, why you? Why are you interested?
So the title for the book, What Your Doctor Isn't Telling You About Food, actually sprung out of a conversation that I had with Professor Christopher Gardner at a conference in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago. So Professor Christopher Gardner, if you haven't heard of him, he's one of the world's leading nutrition researchers. He's a professor of nutrition and metabolic health at Stanford University in California. He has published, over decades, incredible studies looking at the effects of all different sorts of diets on human health. If you saw the Netflix documentary about a year and a half ago, which was You Are What You Eat, which had like these twins who were put on different diets. He was the professor in that documentary, grey hair, green shirt. Absolutely lovely, lovely guy. And I'm seeing him next month. Actually, we're doing a panel together at another event in Washington, D.C. So I'm talking to Christopher and having a coffee. And I asked him, because he was just talking about all of these incredible research he's doing and how doctors aren't talking about it. And I just said to Christopher, what is it that doctors aren't telling their patients about food? And Christopher said, in his Californian accent, he said, What are you not telling them? You're not telling them everything. And I asked him, why? Why are we not telling that? So it's Stanford University, one of the world's leading universities, one of the world's leading medical schools. They have Professor Christopher Gardner, one of the world's leading researchers on food and human health. Christopher gets 80 minutes with med students at Stanford. He gets 4 20-minute sessions to teach them everything about the number one driver of chronic poor health in America, food. In the UK, medical students in surveys tell us that they get about 10 hours of training on nutrition in totality, and most of that focuses on basic biochemistry, how food, the chemical constituents of food, and also learning about certain disease states like rickets and scurvy and all of those highly relevant conditions in the 21st century. And they probably get less than 1 or 2 hours of clinically relevant education. So it's an information gap, it's a confidence gap. So most doctors become doctors because they genuinely want to help people. They go into this to help people, particularly in the NHS, right? We go into work in the NHS because it's free service to people at the point where they require it. We are there to help and get people healthier. Most doctors realize that the food system is making people less healthy, but they do not feel equipped to talk to their patients about it, so they skip those conversations. They're pressed for time. They've got other things that they're being incentivized to do to meet the key performance indicators for their practice, for their GP practice, for example. But the good news is that this is changing. At the end of the book, I have a chapter called The Future of Food and Health. And folks, it is a very optimistic chapter. I recommend, if you go and buy the book, maybe read that chapter first, then go back to the start, okay? Because one of the things that makes me optimistic for the future of food and health, there are lots, is the fact that nutrition and talking to patients about food is now on the medical curriculum in the UK and has been since 2021. So medical schools have begun to implement that since 2021. We're now in 2026. So for the schools, the medical schools that were early adopters to that, we are just now seeing doctors qualifying who were in medical school, John, taught to talk to their patients about food. So I'm hoping that changes.
The potential for it to go traditionally even beyond not talking to them. I speak to a lot of young doctors who have been trained almost to the point where they're asked to kind of poo-poo. Sorry, that's not a joke. Poo-poo
well, I'm
the
a
idea.
gastroenterologist. So
poo-poo the idea of food even being useful for human health. And sometimes they can be incredibly patronizing to people that suggest that nutrition has a role in health. So
I know.
It goes on not knowing, it goes to beyond almost discriminating against those that
That's right.
offer
The old
nutritional
eat
pieces.
whatever you like.
Yeah.
It doesn't make a difference.
Yeah.
Here's a prescription, we'll sort you out. Now, as I describe in the book, healthy dietary interventions and helping and supporting and educating and motivating patients to make healthy dietary changes aren't a replacement for modern medicine. They're not a replacement for pills for blood pressure. They're not a replacement for statins, not a replacement for coronary angiography. But they, in my opinion, they are how we get the very, very best out of modern medicine.
So, the College of Naturopathic Medicine, I know we've got some people from that here, they would argue that in many respects, a lot of their evidence is that diet can actually be a replacement for blood pressure, specifically blood pressure.
Well, let me give you an example. So, yes.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about heart health, okay?
Yes.
So we're going to talk about high blood pressure, heart health, okay? So coronary vascular disease. Coronary vascular disease is our number one killer. So 1 in 3 people who die from coronary vascular disease. So we all die eventually, right? But that's what goes on the death certificate for 1 in 3 people. Coronary vascular disease. Heart disease. And we in the UK think it's inevitable. Heart disease kills 160,000 people in the UK every year. It costs the NHS £16 billion every single year in supporting people who have been diagnosed with coronary vascular disease, heart attack and stroke. We assume in countries where we eat a standard Western diet, the high meat, high fat, high junk food, plant deficient, fiber deficient diet, we assume that heart disease is inevitable. We assume that it's normal when you're 40 that you need a blood pressure tablet and a cholesterol pill. When you're 50 or 60, you start having angina, you get a spray and a medication for angina. And then maybe one day you have a heart attack and maybe you die from a heart attack. We assume that it's inevitable, that it's a normal part of aging. Can food make a difference? Absolutely. So in the medical literature in recent years, the benchmark for a healthy diet used to be the Mediterranean diet score. We had various ways of scoring how Mediterranean one's diet is. In recent years, we've seen the Mediterranean diet score being replaced or substituted with the Healthy Plant-Based Dietary Index. So this is a score on your dietary intakes. And if you're eating really healthily, mostly whole food plant-based, you will smash that index. You'll get a really high score. So we know in the UK, even among people who are at increased genetic risk for heart disease, that people who have the highest healthy plant-based dietary index, so the most plants, the least meat and the least junk in a nutshell, are 50% less likely to have a heart attack or a stroke. That's even with high genetic markers. In the United States, long-term data from the Cardia study showing that people who eat a healthy plant predominant diet are 50% less likely to develop this inevitable disease. The Swedish heart prevention study in both men and women tells us that when we combine a healthy diet with a healthy lifestyle, so a healthy plant-forward diet, exercising regularly, not smoking, avoiding excess alcohol, and maintaining a healthy body weight, we can reduce our risk of heart disease by up to 96%. So this inevitable disease is not inevitable. And even if you've been diagnosed with heart disease, if you've had a heart attack, your diet and lifestyle can still make a tremendous difference. There's one study that was published more than 25 years ago, the Lyon Heart Disease Prevention Study, Lyon. They spelt it wrong.
I know, they spelt it wrong. I couldn't believe it.
Because they were in France. Okay, so they're in France, and so Lyon, the city in France. And so what they did in the Lyon Heart Disease Prevention Study was they took people who'd had a heart attack. They'd already had a heart attack. They had established heart disease. Everybody got standard medical care. Blood pressure pills, statins, they save lives. No doubt about it. If you've had a heart attack, you will leave the hospital with a new prescription. That's really important. Half of the individuals were also given a supported dietary intervention. This was 25 years ago. It was a very plant-forward Mediterranean diet. No red meat, no processed meat, no full-fat dairy. And in France, can you imagine, no butter. So they took away saturated, fat-heavy butter, and they asked them to have rapeseed oil instead. Can you imagine? Sacre bleu. In France, no butter. Okay, what happened? After 4 years, the people who had the standard medical therapy plus the dietary intervention were 75% less likely to have another heart attack. 75% less likely. And in fact, at that point, the ethics committee who were supervising the study stepped in and said, you cannot recruit any more people to this study. The difference between these two groups is stark. It is unethical to not talk to all of these patients about food. Around the same time, maybe a few years later, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn Jr. published the outcomes from his clinic in the Cleveland Clinic in the United States. Now, this wasn't a randomized controlled trial. This was him reporting the outcomes at his clinic. So he did the same thing. He had patients who came to him. They'd had a heart attack. We assumed that in the coming years, they'll have another heart attack. That's how we think it goes, right? You have the first heart attack, you're waiting for the second heart attack. He put his patients on a very strict, healthy, whole food, plant-based diet. So a vegan diet. Over the following, I think it was almost 3.7 years, among the people who didn't stick with the program, about 60% had another heart attack or major coronary event. 60%, kind of what you expect to happen. In the people who did stick with the plan, it was 0.6%. So Dr. Esselstyn, I was at a conference where he was talking about his outcomes, and someone in the audience asked in the Q&A, they said, it was in Palm Springs, California, they said, Dr. Esselstyn, how do you get such good results from your patients? And he said, it's because I'm meaner than other doctors, you know. So when it comes to coronary vascular disease, our number one killer, absolutely food can make a difference. And conversations about food should be front and center, both in primary prevention, reducing the burden of heart disease that we deal with in the UK, but also for individuals who have had a heart attack. In fact, 25 years ago, a group of French medical ethics experts said it was unethical not to do so.
The statement you made earlier was that these good diets are not a replacement for all this great modern medicine. Is it fair to say that, I fund some, it's not a big deal, I fund some medical students at King's, and I got a newsletter for an event at King's, and they said, look, it's a sad reality that many of our medicines have actually not improved health. There actually hasn't been, and your profit motive argument for food, I would make that profit argument for drugs, and I would make the argument that the last thing that drugs companies want to do is to cure cancer, and the last thing they want to do is to cure any diseases when chronic long-term management and chronic long-term subscription businesses, effectively through pharmaceuticals, are much more attractive. And I've got friends senior at Glaxo and various different organizations, and they can tell me studies where they found a plant which had a very good therapeutic effect against cancer. And when they realized that they could not, on a proprietary basis, synthesize and protect that plant, they burnt the research about that plant.
I was recently speaking to someone who was very prominent in the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine. And we had a nice, robust discussion over dinner as well. I was giving a keynote talk at the Irish Society of Lifestyle Medicine in Dublin last year. And it was lovely to go back to Ireland and lovely to give a keynote talk at the Irish Society of Lifestyle Medicine. And after that event, all the faculty were invited out for dinner. And we went to a beautiful plant-based restaurant. And of course we did, because these doctors who were interested in diet and lifestyle weren't going to bring us to a steakhouse. They brought us to a beautiful plant-based eatery with a lovely meal. And I ended up sitting with someone who is very prominent in the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine. And we were talking about the blue zones. So this is Dan Buettner's work. I quote Dan in my book. In fact, he very kindly provided a quote which is on the front of the book. So Dan and his colleagues over 20 years ago described these populations on Earth that have health and longevity. Ikaria, Greece, Loma Linda, California, Sardinia, Nicoya Peninsula, Costa Rica, and I've forgotten one of them.
Which one? Japan.
Japan. Yes, Okinawa, Japan.
No.
And so that was
Japan, anyway.
That was the blue
Japan.
zones. Really, really fascinating. And certainly the blue zones population in Loma Linda, California, have been studied in depth. They've been the subject of some of the most important and most meticulous medical research over decades in the Adventist Health Study 1 and Adventist Health Study 2. So, I can't even remember. So Dan Buettner, excuse me. So Dan, and this whole blue zones concept. And I was speaking to this person from the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine, and I said, Dan's research is phenomenal, so interesting, so applicable, so easy for people to understand. And they were upset because Dan, the company Blue Zones, is now a company. And what they do is that the company, the Blue Zones, does consulting. So if you are the mayor of London or any town or borough and you want to blue zones up your neighborhood and you want to make the population healthier, you can employ this company and give them the contracts. They'll come in, they'll tell you how to change it, the policies you need to put in place, the rules you need to do, how you need to make your roads more friendlier for pedestrians, how you make to transform the food system locally so it's more plants, less junk, less meat. But it costs a lot of money to get them to come in and consult for your town, for your city. But my point, and I would say the same point, is we've got to make health profitable in order for it to flourish. Because it's fantastic for us to sit here and say we all need to eat more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds. But if the poorest 20% of people in the UK can't even afford the basics of a healthy diet, then that's where the government needs to step in. And they need to make healthier food more profitable for people.
So we're spanning now both how does an individual opt out of a system, and you are now introducing ideas about how the system itself can change so we don't have to opt out of it. On the blue zones point, I know obviously a lot of you will be familiar with the blue zone thesis. You'll probably be familiar with the fact that it's actually under attack to some degree, and New Scientist did an article saying, oh, we've been misled by some of the blue zone thinking. I can explain why. But Robert Verkerk, who you spoke to on the phone earlier, spoke to Dan, and he said, Dan, look, I know you can't tell me necessarily through pure meta studies on blue zones, but what do you think are the biggest drivers really of the blue zones? And he said, I think it's purpose. This is Dan. I think it's purpose, and I think it's relationships. And the idea that our body and our mind, or our body and our mind and spirit are separate, is quite a dangerous. Look, it's quite a misleading idea. And you know, I went to the IPF, and you know, I met this guy called Larry Prunebaum talking about this thing I mentioned during the CPNI, cognitive psychoneuroimmunology. One of the things his argument was, we actually talk far too much that food is essential, but completely insufficient. As in, the plant-based diet, we can debate the meat thing later, is essential, but it's completely insufficient. And we don't talk enough about purpose or positivity or relationships.
These things go hand in hand.
Yeah.
But I will say that with regard, and I know Dan as well, he's a great guy, right?
Does he say the same thing to you about his thesis on the power of relationships? And I know that's in his. I know that's in his mix anyway.
Absolutely, and although it's not a major theme of my own book, it's very much food focused. I do talk about that in the final chapter. Build your relationships, share your food, build your community. It's absolutely crucial. This loneliness epidemic that we're having is robbing us of years of life. So that's why in the book I talk about, look, if you are embarking on transforming your personal food environment, which is probably the greatest thing you can do to improve your personal health and longevity, to reduce your personal risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and all of these conditions that we take for granted in countries where we eat the standard global diet, don't do it on your own. Make it a community effort. Share your food. Bring people around. Make it fun. Make it bonding. And build your community. And that's really, really important. I mean, we know that for individuals who eat communally, that it has a huge impact, even just once a week, has a huge positive impact on their mood and their sense of purpose and their well-being. I run events in Exeter, where we do just this. We sit out a microphone, I interview someone, we have a bunch of people sitting there, and we do a live podcast. But we always serve food as well. And we have long tables, we eat communally, we share ideas, and we build our community. That cannot be neglected.
So I mentioned Mark Leponis earlier. He was saying that, you know, he would take people to Canyon Ranch and they would lose weight, they'd be happier. Because that built environment that was created, to your point earlier, it's not like this generation has less willpower. It's not like we have different genes, and therefore, literally, our environment is different. So, you know, the Chinese talk about, you know, the star signs being star luck and your personal luck being you and what you can do. And then they have this layer called earth luck, which is basically how they describe what they call feng shui or feng shui, which is that environment, that energetic environment that you put yourself in. Literally, it could be, do you tidy your pants away? Or it could be, you know, where do you put your kitchen versus, do you eat in the kitchen or do you live in the kitchen? They call that earth luck, which is actually, you're talking about both a built and natural environment. And that can be people-related environment and physical environment. So I'd love you to give people, we're going to have a bit of a debate in a minute about, and then we're going to finish about meat and dairy and all the stuff, the controversial stuff. But could you just give people advice, please, on if they're thinking about your summary on personal luck, if it's just you, what should you be doing to, in a nutshell, to optimize and opt out of the toxic food system? What earth luck should you be creating to create the system and the built environment and personal environment around you? Exactly. And how do we then change that national or local or even local, regional, national structure? It's a big question.
I was just going to say, how long do I have for this answer?
And also, just very quickly then, is there a God?
And why are we here?
Look, I know. Look, I've only done about 10 of these. I'm not very good yet. And let's just start with it.
And we could do the JFK thing as well while we're here.
Oh, it's so obvious. Have you seen the fucking footage of where the security guard kills him? Anyway.
Well, I would tell you. So in my book, I talk about dietary best practices.
Yep.
Now, these could be they could sound simple. They sound easy, but actually in our current food environment, they are not simple and they are not easy, because the sad fact is that if you want to eat a health-promoting diet in a high-income country now, you've got to be ready to face some challenges. And you've got to be ready to be perceived as a little bit different and a little bit fussy and a little bit tricky. But I tell you, it is worth it. Remember, it is worth it, because you can build a healthier future for you and your family and your children. We know, I don't think we have time to get into the longevity piece tonight, but we know that a healthy diet and lifestyle can add 10 to 20 years of additional health span for the average human. 20 years, can you imagine? 10 to 20 years. Who doesn't want that? That could be the difference between being there when your grandchildren finish primary school and being there when they graduate university, write their first book, open their first restaurant, write their first play, have their first art exhibit, and you can be there to talk to them about that. Who doesn't want that, right? So it is worth it. It is absolutely worth it. So remember that and remind yourself that that is absolutely worth it.
What's the what? So look, people can buy the book, right?
Absolutely.
That's fine.
So I'll give you a few things that you can do in your own home, in changing your own home environment. So you want to change your food environment at home. A couple of easy things. Number one, become fiber aware at every meal. Fiber, it's so boring, right? We get fiber from fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, beans, nuts and seeds, legumes, leafy greens, herbs and spices. We know that in the UK, thanks to our standard global diet, 95% of people are not getting enough dietary fiber, which means they're not getting enough fruits and vegetables and all those good foods. They're missing out on the plant-derived protein. They're missing out on the polyphenols, the antioxidants, the beneficial substances, the fiber, the folate, the vitamin E, the vitamin C, the vitamin E, the riboflavin, all of these beneficial substances, the polyphenols, the antioxidants that travel with fiber. So become fiber aware at every meal. Every time, breakfast, you're sitting down, where's the fiber? Okay, I've got oats for breakfast tomorrow, overnight oats. Can I put something else in? So maybe nuts, some frozen fruit. Where is the fiber? It's really, really important. And if you can gradually increase your fiber and get to that magic minimum number of 30 grams of dietary fiber per day, you're doing yourself a huge service in terms of your onward health. People tend to overestimate how much fiber they're getting in their food. At clinic, I will use this shorthand with people. I will ask them how many servings of fruit, how many servings of vegetables, and how many servings of whole grains they're consuming each day. I want the number to add up to 9. I want 3, 3, and 3. Most people are getting far fewer than that. If we can get you to that point, you are getting 30 grams of dietary fiber per day. You are doing better than 90% of people in the UK. Helps to build a healthier gut microbiome that is not conducive to chronic inflammation and poor health. It helps to control your blood sugars. It helps to reduce chronic inflammation. So be fiber aware at every meal. Item number 2, dial your protein towards plants. Protein, 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 protein. Where do you get your protein? I'm asked this question every single day, and I'm glad I am, because it's really, really important. The biggest research studies on protein and human health tell us 2 things. Number 1, getting enough protein is important. If you have a protein deficient diet, you are probably eating an unhealthy diet, and over the next 3 decades, your chances of developing a serious illness are increased. And we're not just talking about muscle wasting, we're talking about heart disease, cancers, respiratory infections, the whole gamut, poor metabolic health, everything. You need to be getting enough protein in your diet. The second thing we can say about protein is that once you're getting enough protein, the more of your protein that comes from plants, the better for your long-term health. And a lot of that is to do with the package that the protein comes with. Every single food you eat, whether it's chicken, salmon, black beans, broad beans, spinach, quinoa, rice, brown, sourdough, anything. Every one of those edible foods that we have available to us contains amino acids. There's 20 different amino acids. They are the building blocks of protein. There's 9 of them that your body can't manufacture. You have to get them from food. All 20 of those amino acids are in every single food you eat. If you're getting those amino acids from fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, particularly the higher protein plant-based foods like beans, lentils, and legumes, or the even higher protein foods that we find in our supermarkets now, like tofu, tempeh, and seitan, you are getting the amino acids and the protein your body needs in a very favorable package. Low in saturated fat, higher in fiber, phytonutrients, all the beneficial compounds we talked about a moment ago, in the absence of saturated fat and dietary cholesterol, pro-inflammatory heme iron that you would get from a piece of steak. So the more of your protein that comes from plants, the better. But you don't necessarily have to go 100%. The studies tell us that even small changes can make a significant difference. One of the largest studies looking at this, which was the Health Professionals study, showed us that when it comes to dialing your protein from meat to plants, even dialing 3% of your protein calories from meat to plants substantially improves your health, reducing your risk of multiple health problems by 20 to 30% in the coming decades. Anyone can make the 3% switch. So if you are making a lasagna or a chili at home and you're using ground beef, swap out a cup of 75 grams of ground beef and put in a few cups of lentils or black beans instead. You have shifted your protein towards plants. If you have scrambled eggs for breakfast in the morning, maybe do half tofu, half eggs. It'll taste pretty much the same, but you are shifting your protein towards plants. It has tremendous health benefits. Now, my own perspective is why stop at 3%, right? Because the benefits stack up and stack up and stack up. I personally haven't eaten animal protein for over maybe 11 years, so I get all of my protein from plants. A lot of health professionals do, but it's moving towards that direction is an excellent idea. And I'll give you a third thing that you can do at home. So we talked about moving your protein towards plants, becoming fiber aware. We talked about sharing your food earlier as well. One of my favorites is grow something and eat it. Grow something and eat it. Whether that's a little vegetable patch out in your back garden. We have a tiny, very scorched vegetable patch in our back garden at the moment. So we also sprout seeds in a little sprouting jar in our living room. It's sprouting right now. I'll have to text my kids later and remind them to rinse the sprouts, which needs to be done twice a day. Because when you take the time to touch the soil, grow some food for yourself, and then enjoy that as part of a meal at home, whether that's some carrots or broccoli or onions or spuds or sprouts or whatever. It could be a parsley or something growing on your windowsill. When you take the time to reconnect with the process of growing food and then you eat it, you suddenly realize not only does it taste better, not only does it reconnect you with the real flavors of these healthy, health-giving foods, it also just reconnects you with the food system and just reminds you that our food system is part of nature. We're part of nature. It's one big system. So there's 6 other best practices in the book, but those are 4.
It's like 0% finance.
But those are 4.
Well, thank you for the teaser. Alan, you talk about in the book there being quite a broad consensus now about what is good for you. I'd like to explore the 97% where we agree, as I said before. I would like to also just, openly question on the 3%. But can I just try and summarize where I think we agree? And I'd love your view on this, right? So we agree that significantly increasing for an ongoing diet. I'd say, by the way, that there is an argument for a very, very 2-week process. Actually, an entirely meat diet is good for a very, very short period. And I'd like to explain why. We'll come back to that in a minute. But from an ongoing diet, eating many more plants is good. Eating a wide array of plants is good. Making sure you get enough protein and fiber from those plants is good. Eat the rainbow is good. I think we can certainly, that's the first thing we can agree on. And you would say 100% plants, and I would say almost.
Well, not necessarily, because so in the book, the approach that I take to this is we need healthy, whole food, plant-forward meals. Okay. We need a healthy, plant-forward, plant-predominant food system. Now, absolutely, we agree. The scientific consensus is not settled, but it exists. Yeah. Okay. Right now, we're talking about meat specifically. Right now, in high-income countries, we eat more meat than is good for us by a long shot. So in the UK, we consume almost 90 kilograms of meat per person per year. In the States, it's over 100 kilos of meat per person per year. The scientific consensus at the moment is that a safe and healthy amount of meat to have in your diet is somewhere between 0 and 20 kilograms of meat per year. So even in the UK, we're exceeding that by about a factor of 5. That's a big difference between what's optimal and what's normal.
So
but it is, and I know in the book I lean very heavily on the Eat Lancet report, which was published in 2019. Second edition was published in 2025 in October. So I virtually attended the launch event of that, the Eat Lancet Commission report. So we talked earlier about this question, what should I eat? Most important question you can ask. The Lancet Medical Journal is one of the oldest and most respected medical journals in the world. Every now and then, it sets up a commission to answer a very difficult question. So they've had commissions on heart disease prevention, commissions on bowel cancer screening, and they had a commission on healthy eating, not just for humans, but for the planet we live on, because we are nature. Our healthy diet has to support healthy ecosystems, or else we are on a road to nowhere. They published the Eat Lancet report in 2019, republished in 2025 with more data. Their conclusion, which was broad and designed to be interpreted in different foods and different food cultures as applicable, was that a planetary health plate would consist, by volume, of 50% fruits and vegetables, and the remainder of that diet would consist of healthy whole grains, plant-based oils, so your olive oils, your canola oils, etc., high-protein plant-derived foods, so your tofus and your tempehs and your beans and your legumes, etc., with a small, or I think they were used the word modest, with some modest optional animal-based foods included, if that suits your food culture. Okay, so the amounts of animal products that they deemed as being safe and healthy within a healthy dietary pattern were for processed meat, bacon and sausages, actually zero. There's a whole chapter in my book about that. Zero. So for red meat, they said about 14 grams per day. For poultry, 30 to 60 grams per day. For fish, 30 to 60 grams per day. For eggs, about 3 eggs per week. For dairy, between 0 and 300 calories per day. So that, to a British audience, sounds bonkers. It sounds really, really difficult. How would I eat that little meat, that few eggs, that many fruits, that many vegetables, that many whole grains, that many legumes? I'm going to have to change my whole food system in order to do that. But you know, they had 60 academics from 3 different continents analyzing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of papers. The process took years. If you took their results to a population, one of the blue zones populations, let's say, and you said, look, we had all these experts, they said, this is how we should eat. It's taken us years to publish this paper. They would say, what a waste of time. If that's how we eat.
Okay, so
that answers the question, how much meat?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, so we have a disagreement on some of the Eat Lancet methodology, and it's quite subtle, but it's worth sharing, right? The number one argument, we should also focus on where we agree, which is eat a ton of less meat and eat a lot more plants. There are 3 concerns that I have over the Eat Lancet thing I'd like to ask you, and I'd like to just allow anyone else that has the concerns about it. One is it's quite a kind of UN-minded imposition of globalist thinking that has, in many practical applications of itself, obliterated local ways of doing things by forcing a very one way of thinking globalist view on populations and indigenous people in Africa, Asia and South America that were doing just fine, thank you very much. That's the first argument. The second argument is that all of the papers most of the papers they used were based on badly farmed beef, which I would agree is absolutely
but of course that's because that's where most of the meat comes from.
Right.
So 90, you can correct me on this, but perhaps 90 to 97% of meat that's consumed on the planet comes from intensive animal agriculture.
What I'm saying,
and the reason it does is because we're eating so much of it.
But that should be in the message, rather than saying.
But if you want to do a study on organic meat, you're going to have a tough time doing it, because there's very few people who were only eating that sort of meat.
So I encourage you to read the 2, because each time the Eat Lancet report came out, the Alliance for Natural Health did, I think, an excellent, very scientific challenge to Eat Lancet. And if anyone is interested, I can recommend that, notwithstanding the fact that you and someone like Rob Verkerk, who wrote those counters to the Eat Lancet report, would agree on most things.
Yeah, of course.
But he would say
Absolutely.
three things. One, it's a very globalist top-down methodology. Secondly, it's that very strongly, and you argue against regenerative farming to some degree in here because of the protein to input energy ratios, which we'll come back to, that actually we should consider a small amount of very well-reared grass-fed beef in our diet, and that shouldn't be put into the same bucket as the badly farmed beef. And lastly, there's actually four things, I'll keep it simple, that we know, even Bear Grylls said, I think today, I used to be a vegan, but I now tell my kids to eat offal. So I don't think that the nucleotides that you get in offal are replicated in plants. And there are certain, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, certain amino acids that might be a small range, but actually literally are not represented in plants. So a small amount of offal or a small amount of...
all plants contain all 20 amino acids. And if you're consuming enough calories each day, you will really struggle to be deficient in a given amino acid if you're following the general principles that I outlined earlier about what a healthy plate looks like. Bear Grylls is not a nutrition guru by any chance, by any stretch of imagination. A few years ago, he told Louis Theroux that he hadn't farted in years and that he thought farting was bad for your gut. We know that the production of intestinal gas is a normal human function. It's a function of a healthy gut microbiome.
Is there data that says that eating offal is bad?
So
is there data?
So I wouldn't take data for Bear Grylls, but is there in that offal is red meat? Yeah. It's organ meat.
Yeah.
Yes, there is, of course. So in excess, it contains too much saturated fat.
What defines
excess? It contains too much pro-inflammatory heme iron. So if you can enjoy that food as part of your diet, but I would still keep it to a small component of your diet. And you still want to make sure that your saturated fat intake is less than about 5% of your total calories, which is difficult to do in a meat-heavy diet.
But why would we say to people, I can understand the argument saying, cut down on it dramatically, but let's take nucleotides as an example. Do nucleotides exist in plants? I don't think they do.
So I would have to go, so the theories that you put forward tonight, I will put my hand up and say, I'm not familiar with them, but if you could share them with me, I would love to read them.
I'm just going to run quickly through some yes-no questions, because I want to cover them, but I don't want to go into
Okay, yes-no. I'm terrible at yes-no questions.
Okay. Look, every time we know that it depends.
Rapid fire.
It depends is always the answer, right? Let's give me 10 seconds on the following. Dairy.
Milk is for babies. Beyond the age of 24 months, humans have no physiological need for breast milk, either from humans, cows, pigs, or donkeys. In the UK, we have a very unhealthy food system. No one is arguing that. Dairy is a useful calcium supplement in the UK diet because we don't eat enough fruits and vegetables and leafy greens and whole grains and all of those foods that actually contain the calcium that the cows produce in the milk. And so we don't need dairy to be healthy. For some reason, we've all developed a little bit of a mistrust of the food industry for many of the reasons that I've just spoken about this evening. For some reason, we all tend to trust the dairy industry. Maybe it's because they come into our schools when we're little kids, like I talk about in my book, where Mary the dairy would come in and hand out cartons of milk when we were little children. And we thought she was a teacher. And she was obsessed with one lesson: drink your milk. Milk builds better bones. Humans do not need milk beyond the age of 20. It does contain some protein, some calcium, but there are many arguably healthier sources of those nutrients available to us.
The one area that I was concerned about in your book a little bit was, I agree that blood sugar spikes, insulin secretion, managing blood sugar, it's a cycle, it's absolutely normal. I would argue that excessive ongoing everyday blood sugar increases with associated insulin secretion, which I do believe actually helps the cells store more fat. I just wonder whether there's a balanced argument there, because I read the chapter and I thought, can't we just agree that actually I feel much better when I'm not having constantly bad carbs in inverted commas.
The chapter in the book is called Busting the Sugar Spike Myth. Okay, so in the recent years, we've had these glucose gods and goddesses, and CGMs are everywhere. CGMs are really useful for people with diabetes, potentially life-saving. They're really, really useful. If we didn't have CGMs, we wouldn't be talking about this tonight. If they developed a continuous lipid monitor, we'd be talking about that. If they developed a continuous amino acid monitor, we'd be talking about that, right? So the only reason we're talking about it is because CGMs were invented and now everybody needs one, okay? So the idea that we read about online that your sugar going up and down indicates a disease process and we need to do everything we can to flatten the curve is actually really poor science. And in most of those cases, they are exaggerating normal physiological responses or taking small studies on people with diabetes and extrapolating them inappropriately to the general population. That's not to say that insulin resistance isn't a problem. It absolutely is. I spoke earlier about the fact that 40% of people in high-income countries are metabolically unhealthy. Insulin resistance is a big part of that. Now, because insulin resistance causes your blood sugars to go up, people assume that sugar is the only cause of insulin resistance. It's absolutely not. The standard Western diet, the high meat, high saturated fat, fiber deficient diet, which also contains a lot of free sugar, promotes metabolic dysfunction. It promotes the deposition of fat within our muscle cells, within our liver. This causes lipotoxicity, which causes insulin resistance, which means we have more sugar circulating in our bloodstream than is good for us, and that is a hallmark of poor metabolic health. What the blood sugar influencers have done is they've taken the very sensible advice to limit your intake of free sugars to 5 to 10% of your calories and turn that into a whole online movement. If you are worried that you might have insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, go to your doctor and ask them to check you. They will check you very easily. They'll do a HbA1c blood test. They won't give you a blood glucose monitor, and they're right not to, because the studies show that what your blood sugar is doing on a day-to-day basis does not correlate with your HbA1c result. It doesn't correlate with your personal level of insulin resistance. So I think the whole blood sugar spike thing is a distraction. I agree that simple sugars should be reduced to 5 to 10% of our calories, but people are conflating healthy whole carbohydrates like brown rice, quinoa, oats, etc. They are putting them in the same bracket as Skittles and chocolate bars. Okay. There was a headline in the Telegraph, I think it was in the Telegraph last year, saying why bananas are a Mars bar in yellow skin. Now, we know that that's bonkers because the complex carbohydrates we get in naturally unprocessed carbohydrate-rich foods help to fuel satiety. They help to build a healthier gut microbiome. They help to reduce chronic inflammation. They help to build a healthy, health-promoting diet.
So we can agree that all carbs can be put into the same bucket, or they should be differentiated. But even dietitians in the NHS will take someone and go, did you know there's carbohydrates, proteins and fats? And you go, no.
Yeah, we need to move beyond that. Right? We need to talk about food.
The point is that, can we agree that there are some carbohydrates are better than others?
Oh, sure. Like Skittles and chocolate
we can agree
versus quinoa and
we can
brown
agree
rice.
that. We can agree
I had
that.
brown rice for lunch.
Thank you, at Lyon.
At Lyon. It's absolutely delicious.
Okay, last question really, which is ultra-processed foods. It's the talk of the moment. I mean, I mentioned CP&I earlier. The reason I mentioned it to you, and then you had to go away and do your books, was, Leo Prunberg at the Integrative Personal Medicine Congress. I was fascinated by his thesis. You went to the talk of someone and you were a bit concerned that they didn't know why ultra-processed foods were hurting people. I'll leave it at that. One of his things he's demonstrated is that this is a ridiculous number. He says that the programs he's run estimate there's 4 trillion new novel toxins or bits of information, pollutants really, that the body genetically from 100 years ago didn't have to do a friend or foe identification of. We know that from a so-called autoimmune perspective, the body, his thesis is that the brain is incredibly powerful at curing things that it understands and knows about. But it is being confused by so many toxic inputs. It could be a new smoke pollutant that it does not recognize, or a new piece of information in a food where it says, what is this? And so it's a little bit like you're on a battleship and all of these different missiles are coming towards you, and your IFF, your identify friend or foe technology, is breaking down because it doesn't know whether that is actually a wheat particle because it's been so modified. It doesn't know what that pollutant is, and therefore it doesn't know where to allocate its healthy immune response, and therefore it's constantly and chronically inflamed. Now, that's just one thesis for why ultra-processed foods might be conflating health. But I read some of the research that he referred to, and it was quite plausible. But what's your view on ultra-processed foods?
So ultra-processed foods, the NOVA classification has been with us for 17 years. Sao Paulo, Brazil, Professor Carlos Monteiro and his colleagues looked at how the food system in Brazil had changed in recent decades and how health was deteriorating. Of course, what they were witnessing was the invasion of the global standard diet that we've been talking about tonight, increased risks of heart disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and other conditions. And they felt that the old way of looking at how healthy a food was, i.e. looking at its macronutrients, how much protein, how much fat, how much carbohydrates it contained, was no longer sufficient to account for this. So they developed the NOVA system, the new system. So they divided all foods into 4 groups. Unprocessed foods, which are foods in their naturally occurring source state, so fruits and vegetables, beans and nuts and seeds, but also meat and eggs and poultry. Milk, although I have problems with that, which I explain in the book. Milk that you buy in the supermarket is not an unprocessed food. It's been through a huge process, but anyway, they included milk. Group 2 being your culinary ingredients, your salt, sugar, fats, oils. Group 3 being the foods that you can make for yourself by combining the other 2. So these are things you can make in your kitchen. Soups, hummus, pesto. You take some cheese and salt and sugar and tomatoes and garlic and onion, and you process the food in your kitchen and you make a processed food. That's group 3. But they also described group 4, this ultra-processed food group. These are food-like products which are produced using industrial processes that you cannot reproduce in a normal kitchen. Yes. So they also included in the classification the purpose of the change. So if it was to increase shelf life and palatability and craveability, then that qualified as an ultra-processed food. Now, since they initially described that, we have seen ultra-processed foods absolutely dominate our food system. The food industry loves them. You can take very cheap inputs, you can add salt, sugar, and fat, the things that make us less healthy, unhealthy fats. There is a place for healthy fats in diet. But salt, sugar, and unhealthy fats, you can take flavor enhancers, you can take emulsifiers, carboxymethylcellulose, polysorbate 80, carrageenan, lecithins, and you can make these foods craveable, shelf-stable, cheap, with high profit margins. The substances that are in these foods are a concern. They are a concern, particularly dietary emulsifiers and artificial sweeteners. And the fact that these foods now account for 65% of the food consumed in the UK is a concern. The fact that for 20% of people, they make up 80% of the calories is a concern. The fact that the less money you have to spend on food, the more of your diet is made up by ultra-processed foods is a concern. Because primarily those foods are not designed with health at all in mind. They're about craveability, shelf stability, and profit margins. Last year, Professor Carlos Monteiro and colleagues, including Dr. Chris Van Tulliken, published a series of papers revisiting the ultra-processed food landscape and the evidence. And again, looking at much more evidence, they were able to tell us that whatever chronic disease you're worried about, John, the more ultra-processed foods in your diet, the more likely you are to develop a health problem, whether that's mental health, infections, heart disease, etc., etc., etc. But there's 2 subtleties that they highlighted in that series of papers that are now completely absent from the public debate or almost always missed. Number 1, the main reason that these foods are problematic is because for a long, long time, if you were on a budget and you wanted to feed your family fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, lentil dal, zuppa toscana, miso soup, made with very basic plant-based ingredients, those were the cheap and available staples. That's how you fed your family. That's no longer the case. So it's not just what's the bad stuff that's in them, it's what they've displaced from the human diet. So they have displaced fruits and vegetables and legumes and beans and nuts and seeds and lentils. They've been pushed aside and replaced by ultra-processed foods. So there's the opportunity cost with those in terms of health and longevity. The other thing that they, of course, pointed out is that being an unprocessed food does not automatically mean that that food can be enjoyed to excess or labeled as healthy. And they, of course, pointed out that the NOVA classification is not a replacement for existing guidelines to avoid excess red meat, for example. It's a complement to it. So I have seen influencers, including one that a person who wrote a book about this, sit in front of a group just like this, praising red meat and butter because they're unprocessed, completely missing the point, completely misunderstanding the science on health and longevity, completely omitting the fact that foods that are high in saturated fats are our number one driver of high cholesterol, our number one driver of our number one killer, cardiovascular disease. And then we've also had the food industry who gave us ultra-processed foods using the national conversation about ultra-processed foods to sell us even more crap, to be quite honest. And the perfect example of this, and I do shop at Marks and Spencer's sometimes, but not always. We shop elsewhere. But we do sometimes shop at Marks and Spencer's. So last year, Marks and Spencer's launched one ingredient cornflakes. Did anybody see that? One ingredient cornflakes. The marketing, when they launched, said, enjoy breakfast the way it was meant to be, or the traditional cornflake. Now, let's be clear. I do not recommend just eating corn for breakfast, even if you pour milk on it. A bowl of cornflakes is not an optimal way to start your day. I know it's convenient, I know they're crunchy and they're quite tasty, but I would rather you had a more varied breakfast, okay? But if you or your family or your kid is just going to have cornflakes for breakfast, then the standard fortified cornflake that has added vitamins and B vitamins and iron and folate is actually the preferred choice. So the food industry steps in. Then we've got the ADHB promoting the interests of the meat industry in the UK, telling us to eat red meat because it's unprocessed. So the ultra-processed discussion is interesting, it's important, but there is subtlety and nuance to it.
Very helpful.
And in the book, I have the ultra-processed food traffic light system, including green light ultra-processed foods, because ultra-processed foods aren't going anywhere. We have limited budgets, we have limited time, we want to eat really healthily, and actually certain ultra-processed foods can help to support the healthy plant predominant diet and make it convenient and tasty and achievable.
I'd like to just preface a conversation I'd love to have with you when you come back. One would be the meat, the offal discussion. If you'd like to come back, I'd love to have that discussion with you. I'd just like to just suggest one thing before I go to question, which is the lobbying pressure that you mentioned of ultra-processed foods. We know from an epidemiological, as in population study, that carbonated sugary drinks increase your likelihood of diabetes. We know that water versus those sugary drinks doesn't increase your chance of diabetes. But we know that the with sweeteners, the acetylsulfame K, aspartame, diet drinks increase your chances of diabetes to the same level as the drinks with sugar in them. We know that at a population level. And we know that there always needs to be in science a plausible mechanism for why that is. Do you have a plausible mechanism for why sodas with sweeteners in increase the diabetic outcomes the same as sweeteners?
So I've seen several studies actually contradict what you've said, actually, because I think the excess consumption of free sugars bypasses normal appetite control and regulation. So it makes us more likely to gain more weight, which is a big risk factor for insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. I think there are some studies showing that diet sodas do actually combat that risk rather than sugar-sweetened beverages. So that'll be part two. That'll be part two.
Absolutely, part two. And I have a plausible mechanism for that, which is based on an Israeli study that says that aspartame destroys your healthy gut microbiome. But we can look at that together.
Part two. My take-home message tonight is that the food that we eat every day is actually the most powerful lever that we have to improve our health and the health of future generations here in the UK. You can start small. You don't need to be perfect, but dialing your protein towards plants, eating more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, more plants, less meat and less junk is pretty much applicable to everybody. It can make a tremendous difference.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Deep to ask a question.
Thank you so much. There was so many facts that you gave. Thank you. One question I have is, what would you say would be like an ideal meal? And John's listening, so he might even put it in
an ideal meal.
Yeah, and a sweet treat. You've got to have a sweet treat as well.
Oh, and a sweet treat.
One good meal that we should be having regularly, and then a sweet treat.
This is like one of these death row questions.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So for me, I would probably have what a question. So, okay, I would probably have some brown rice, which I love. I would have a rich savory sauce with that, and I would serve it with both beans and tofu. I love both of those. I would add some leafy greens on top, which would be delicious. So maybe baby leafy greens. Doesn't have to be too fancy. Even one of those little bags from the supermarket would do just fine. And then I'd probably put some soy sauce on top for a little bit extra flavor. And then I'd put a little bit of hot sauce. I'd put some, and in our kitchen at home, we have a shelf up in the kitchen, which is just lots of jars. And we got various like seeds, ground nuts, nutritional yeast, chili flakes, and you can just add a few extra dashes of flavor and everything. So it would have whole grains, it would have leafy greens, it would have beans. And look, I'm a sucker for tofu, so I would have some tofu on there as well. I love it. This sweet treat. I would take a medjool date and I'd jam a square of really good dark chocolate in it, and then I'd smear some nice peanut butter on top. And I'd have that with a cup of tea with oat milk.
On the menu, yeah?
Yeah, well, you know what? That's a good start to a tasty meal.
Yep.
It's a good start. we can work together. Philly, because Philly always likes to ask questions.
I do. Hello, Philly J. Lay here from the Wellness Way podcast.
Oh, hi.
Quite a lot to unpack there. So I just wanted to bring up the elephant in the room, and it is the elephant for everybody, really. And that's that you talk about a plant-based diet, but we are the only mammals on the planet that spray our plants with chemicals to keep other plants off, other mammals off, and animals and pests, to kill them, and then we go and eat it. And an organic farmer is tested for 361 chemicals that he must not have in his food every year to get his Soil Association certificate. And so you talk about things like, soy. 85% of the world's soy is GMO. With GMO food, that means that they're bred by Monsanto. They are soaked in Roundup so that they can be sprayed with Roundup on a regular basis.
And the question?
And the question is, that surely has to be more toxic than a grass-fed cow?
So the science, the evidence is really, really clear that among populations, even in the US, the UK, Ireland, for example, the more fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes and nuts and seeds that people eat, and the less meat they eat, not necessarily zero, but lower meat consumption, the lower their rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, even COVID-19. So even during the COVID pandemic, we saw that people who described their diets as vegan or vegetarian were substantially less likely to contract COVID-19 by about 10% here in the UK. And if they did get COVID-19, they were 75% less likely to end up being hospitalized, having pneumonia, or ending up in the ITU. So those are facts. Now, the other side of that fact is that most of those fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds that they're consuming are produced in a conventional food system. So we can't deny that. So eating fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds right now in the 21st century in high-income countries makes us healthier. Could they make us even healthier if they were all produced organically? Well, we don't really have the studies proving that yet. Certainly, producing fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds by organic methods is kinder to the soil and kinder to the planet and kinder to the environment. I don't think there's any arguing with you there. I would also point out, And we kind of touched on this. The final chapter, the second final chapter in the book is called Healthy Humans Need a Healthy Planet. We as people, I think, vastly underestimate the impact that our food actually has on the planet. So there are 100 million square kilometers of habitable land on Earth. 100 million square kilometers on Earth. You could say in the entire known universe, which is quite humbling, isn't it? We're on this little blue dot, and in the vastness of nothing, we've got 100 million square kilometers of habitable land. All of our cities, London, the village I grew up in Ireland, all of our cities and urban areas occupy only 1% of that land. We are really, really efficient with our living space. But 50% of that land is taken up by agriculture. We use half of the available land on the planet to produce our food. In order to take a natural landscape and turn it into any sort of landscape that produces food, whether that's highly intensive or regenerative or organic, you have to transform that landscape substantially. You have to, otherwise you can't use it to grow food safely. You've got to take out the plants that are growing there. You've got to chase away all the animals that might eat the food that is being produced there. We are doing that to half of the planet right now. 80% of that land is used for animal agriculture. 80% used for grazing animals that we eat or growing crops for the animals to eat. You're worried about GMO, you're worried about the chemicals that are used to produce all of these foods, worried about the effect that might have on human health, worried about the effects that might have on planetary health. The vast majority of all of those inputs sit within animal ag right now. They sit within the production of meat and dairy. If we were to move to a system that was predominantly plant-based, and I'm not just saying this, the experts I spoke to for the book are saying it, Sir David Attenborough, national treasure, is saying this, that if we could move to a plant-based or plant-predominant food system, we could take an area the size of the United States, Europe, China, and Australia and leave it alone. We could stop spraying it with everything. We could stop damaging that environment and return it to nature. So I take your point, absolutely, but the evidence supports plant-based diets is better for humans and better for the planet. And the majority of the things that you're worried about are actually occurring within animal agriculture. So is it healthier to eat small amounts of organically produced, regenerative produced beef than eating vast amounts of intensively produced meat? Yes, of course it is. But if we want to produce our meat through that sort of system, and we want everybody on the planet to be able to eat some meat, we need to reduce global meat production probably by a factor of 90 to 95.
One of the things which we study in Leon is and you write about it in your book, is the amount of grams of feed required for the same amount of grams or kilograms of meat output. And, we know that goes from something like 5 times with beef or 4 times with lamb, and chickens are traditionally about 2.5. And to get to a 1.3 relationship between the amount of feed that you have to put in versus the kilograms of output, the lowest metric is the Ross birds that are now naturally, in inverted commas, genetically changed or reared without science, but actually just through natural selection, accelerated natural selection, and that's a 1.3. So even to your point, Alan, even at the lowest input to output metric, you have to get quite a genetically modified beast in order to achieve that. And that's validating your argument about intensity. Yeah.
And even the most efficient animal-based food requires more energy, more water, and more land than a plant-based food. So I talked earlier about being at home and you're making a spaghetti bolognese or a lasagna tonight. This surprises people, but if you are making that, shall we say, lasagna, using some beef from the local farmer who lives 5 miles away from your house, and you have chosen to buy it locally because you're worried about the environment, you forget about health for now, but you're just worried about the environmental impacts of the food. it will surprise a lot of people to learn that if you made that same dish with beans that came from France or elsewhere, the environmental impact of the bean-based dish is still massively lower than the environmental impact of the beef-based dish. People will be surprised to learn that the environmental impacts of the bean-based dish, with the beans that came from another country perhaps, is still substantially lower than the environmental impact of the beef-based dish using beef that was grown within 5 miles of your house. Because the water use, the environmental impact, the pollution, the damage that is caused to the environment by our food production happens during the production. In fact, the transport of beef accounts for only, I believe, about 6% of its environmental impact. So we need the food system to change to reflect that. A lot of people, we talked a lot tonight about system change, and people think it can't happen. This isn't in the book, but I thought about this on the way here this evening, okay? My parents are in their late 70s. If you had told them when they were growing up that by the time they were in their 60s, that every day they would separate their plastic from their glass, from their cardboard, from their food waste, and put them into 4 different bins and leave them outside the house every Monday morning, they would not have believed you. What happened in the intervening years? Did everybody become a hippie? Did everybody become obsessed with recycling? Absolutely not. The law changed. The regulations changed. If they don't do that, they will not collect their rubbish. So we can take the same approach to food. I know it sounds harsh, but we can use legislation. We can use the structures, we can use the laws, we can use the incentives. This was all in the UK food strategy back in 2021. Talked about a healthier food system for Britain. But of course, talking about a healthy food system isn't good enough. You've got to put the structures and the laws and the supports and the funding in place to make it a reality.
So it's Jonathan Romano. John Vincent, I want to start off with you, thanking you for your mission, your vision.
We know each other, don't we?
We had a screening of my film,
Your
Beyond
film?
the Pill.
Sorry, yes. And what's it called?
It's called Beyond the Pill, and it will be on Amazon in August, so stay tuned.
You've got to say, what do we do? Can we watch it now? Or
I would say...
can we do another screening here?
We can do another screening here, John.
Thank you, Jonathan. And there's a brilliant bit of him and Wim Hof in a ice bath, which is really worth watching. A round of applause for this man. Absolutely fantastic man. Please, Jonathan, ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. Alan, I'd like to not give you a heart attack with...
That's okay. I've checked my Chad Vask score, as I recommend everybody does. My 10-year risk of a myocardial infarction is 2%. So do your worst.
All right, amazing. So I'm going to run you through what I eat. So in the morning, I would say late morning, I would probably have intermittent fasting. So I'd have this smoothie around 11:30, and it's a mixture of bone broth, cacao, and I'm now experimenting with 3 raw eggs inside of this mix. And I may throw in some electrolytes, etc. So I start off with that. At lunch, I have 2 cans of sardines. It's now become infamous to be the protein bar stacked with a multivitamin. So I have that with some fermented foods and quinoa. And then for dinner, I have liver with quinoa and maybe some cottage cheese. Okay. The challenge that I also have, Alan, is I eat quite a lot. I don't gain a lot of weight, but I'm curious to hear from your masterclass that you've generously shared with us and what you've read in a book. How does this diet come across to you? I'm generally curious.
Yeah, so a low-carb, high-fat diet. Is that fair enough? So it doesn't matter how it comes across to me. It's what the research tells me about it. So individual stories like yours are really interesting. And thank you for sharing it. But individual stories don't shape nutrition advice for anybody, nor should they. We need to look at the body of evidence, okay? Another person could sit here to me and say, Alan, you're going to have a heart attack, but I smoke 20 cigarettes a day. I always have a whiskey before I drive, and I never wear my seatbelt. Yet here I sit, okay? Now, I'm not comparing any of your habits to their habits, but I'm just saying that's a really poor way to generate public health messaging about food and behaviors, okay? A few years ago, Professor Kevin Hall at the National Institutes for Health ran a study. Professor Kevin Hall, a lot of people have heard about his ultra-processed food study. Chris Van Tulliken talks about a lot. It was in his book. It's a very important study. He showed that if you change someone's environment from a whole food environment to an ultra-processed food environment, they automatically consume about 600 or 700 extra calories per day. Really interesting study on the food environment. He also did a research study a few years ago looking at a low-carb, high-fat diet against a whole food, plant-based diet. Again, he took volunteers, changed their food environment. Okay, same calories. It wasn't controlled in terms of how much food they were allowed to eat. They were told to eat until they felt well filled. And in that study, in the low-carb, high-fat group, generally people did lose some weight, which is usually a good thing for people. But they were losing a lot of water weight and a little bit of muscle weight, not so much fat weight. Also during the study, on average, they got metabolically less healthy. So they didn't know this, they couldn't feel it, they couldn't perceive it. They all said they enjoyed the food, actually. But their markers for inflammation went up. Their LDL cholesterol went up. Their fasting glucose went up. So even in the matter of a few weeks, they became metabolically less healthy. So that's important to note. We also know from long-term studies that the more low carb one's diet is, particularly if one's diet draws on animal products for a lot of calories, so low carb, higher fat diet, in the long term, on average, individuals who maintain that dietary pattern have an average reduced life expectancy of 5 years. Now, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about the average. Okay, so on average, this is a way of eating that reduces our life expectancy, our health expectancy. There are studies showing that if you have a low carb, high fat, high protein diet that draws on plant-based sources of food, that you can attenuate those potentially negative effects. So on the average, I would view that that's not a way that I would advise people to eat. If it's working for you, that's great. Do you know your LDL cholesterol is, your HbA1c is? Do you know all those numbers? Because feeling great is one thing, but being metabolically healthy is another. You seem like a really tuned in, switched up guy. So I presume you know what your HbA1c is, your blood pressure is, what your LDL cholesterol is. You don't have to disclose it, it's fine. But if someone is eating like that, I would encourage them to check their numbers. It's in the book. It's best practice number 8, I think, is know your numbers. Because feeling good isn't good enough. You need to know that you're metabolically healthy.
I'm actually a student at the College of Naturopathic Medicine, so I'm kind of learning a lot about what you guys are talking about. And for my specialty, I'm kind of thinking a lot to do about the mental health connection to food and eating. And I think as someone who's grown up in the social media age, I think, as you know, there's obviously a lot of misinformation, but a lot to do with the beauty standard. And something that we haven't discussed today is the GLP-1 kind of, I don't think you would call it a crisis yet, but I think it's something that's growing. So I just firstly wanted to know your thoughts on that. And then also my other question is, when we are speaking to clients at the moment, it's very much about, unfortunately, healthy eating is unfortunately very unsociable, and healthy living is actually unfortunately very unsociable. So I totally agree with the loneliness epidemic and the mental health epidemic that we're also facing, and how living that lifestyle, yes, you said it's coming across as picky or a bit annoying, but actually a lot of people who are living that way are becoming less sociable. So how to combat that as well.
And we didn't even talk about quitting drinking. Oh my goodness. No, I get it. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that feeds into what we were talking about earlier. Share your food, build your community. In the book, I talk about my friends Stephen and David Flynn, the Happy Pair Boys. They live that to the max, over the last 20 years. They have built a community around them that absolutely prioritizes community, friendship, healthy eating, daily exercise. And they make it look easy on their social media, but I have hung out with those boys for weeks at a time, and I got to tell you, it is due to meticulous scheduling. We're going to swim in the sea then, we're going to eat our breakfast then, we're going to meet our buddy then, we're going to work out then we're going to drive the kids to school, then we're going to come back, then we're going to go to, so you do need to be intentional about it. Although, we talked about the blue zones earlier, the key thing that Dan will tell you about the blue zones populations is that they're not doing any of that because they don't have to, because their environment and their society is actually built to make those things automatic. But, central London, if you want to live really healthily and eat really healthily and engage with friends, you want to be pretty good at organizing stuff, don't you? You need to curate that existence until it becomes your default pathway. You asked about GLP-1s. So I talk a lot about GLP-1s in the book. So when you eat, your body produces hormones that signal satiety to your body. You can optimize the production of those hormones by eating healthy, fiber-rich food, builds a healthy gut microbiome. Your body then sends signals like GLP-1, glucagon-like peptide 1, and peptide YY enter your bloodstream and signal to your brain and your satiety centers that you have had enough food. I think for a long, long time in human history, that signal was saying to the person, look, you finally have enough food. You can go and do something else for 10 minutes. But now in the 21st century, it tells us when to stop eating. Unfortunately, because of our food environment that we've been talking about at length this evening, that signal isn't strong enough for a lot of people. The GLP-1 medications basically trick your body into thinking that you're full of the GLP-1 hormone, so your body feels completely full at all times. They help a lot of people. The weight loss in the studies is like 20 to 30% of weight loss, which is helpful. Shedding excess body weight does make people healthier. I'm glad they exist. They are helping a lot of people. They're not a magic pill or a magic shot. They're not as easy to be on as people assume. You know, the TikTok world paints these as the magic bullet. The data tells us that after 12 months, only 1 in 3 people are still taking them. After 2 years, it's 1 in 7. Side effects can happen. I've taken care of patients who've had side effects from GLP-1s. I imagine the new generation of these medications will be safer and possibly more effective. They definitely have a place in the world. It makes me sad that we need a medication to protect us from our food environment. I wish that wasn't the case. I wish our food environment made us healthier rather than less healthy. I'm also acutely aware that by 2030, it's estimated that the global GLP-1 market will be worth $100 billion. $100 billion a year. And I just wish some of that money was invested in teaching kids and grown-ups how to eat and cook and take care of themselves. And I wish some of that money was invested in reforming our food system and transforming our food system and making it healthier. So I'm not against GLP-1s. I think people, if they are using them, they should be free to talk about it. They shouldn't be embarrassed. They should be telling their friends about it. They should just be doing that. But they should also be doing the other things alongside, because the GLP-1s only work as long as you're on them. They don't change the food environment. They don't remove the stresses of modern living. They don't remove the social media feeds and the advertising. They won't do anything about the 3 or 4 different posters for McDonald's breakfasts that I drive past every morning on my way to work. So they're just only part of the solution, you know.
Alan, you've talked a lot about the human cost, economic cost, and otherwise with regard to animal husbandry. When the government want to change people's behaviour, they send their nudge unit into action to do these kind of things. Can you see a point in future where eating meat might become outlawed?
I don't know about outlawed, but I think the food system does have to change so we eat less meat, and that is going to take regulation and systemic change. So it's going to take a lot of nudging, isn't it? I mean, the fact is we've got 8 billion humans now. We are using half of the available land on the planet to produce our food, and 80% of that is animal agriculture. And no matter how freaky or funky the animals become, if we double the human population, we are literally, and we keep eating like this, we are going to run out of planet. You know, I was giving a talk to the European Space Agency a few years ago because they're very interested in plant-based nutrition, and they were very interested on what they should be sending up to the International Space Station and on future missions to Mars to feed their astronauts and, you know, the pioneers who'll go and live on these other planets. And I said to them, look, just while we're talking about this, have you guys found another planet, ideally within reach of Earth, where we could grow food if we run out of space on this planet? Or maybe we could go live there and grow food here. And they said, absolutely not. We've only got this one planet. And although you tonight, John, and some members of the audience have been very, very interested in regenerative agriculture, to produce meat and animal products. The concept being that intensive agriculture is bad, so if we go back to old, less intensive means, then that will be good. The fact is that will never be able to meet the current demand for chicken nuggets and chicken breast. And I don't say chicken a lot because people love chicken. It's one of our favorite meats. We will never be able to meet that demand for the growing population if more and more countries start demanding more and more meat. So while regenerative is interesting, I think the future is going to be synthetic meats and things that look and taste like meat, but never came from an animal. Winston Churchill talked about this, I think back in the 1950s, when he said that through science, and I'm going to mangle this quote, but
it was him or Oscar Wilde.
Yeah. It was Winston Churchill. He said that at some point in the future, human ingenuity will outgrow the absurdity of growing an entire chicken just to eat its wing or its breast. And I think that will become an inevitability because we're going to run out of planet.
And do you think that bugs could be the next thing for us?
Bugs?
To eat rather than...
Yep. John, bugs on the menu?
I've heard about it for like 20 years. And just to say, I think obviously on legislation and what we should do in terms of law, I think we all know that the answer is a programmable digital currency where your salary is decided by the government and and your car's electric and you can't go anywhere in it unless you've been vaccinated. So we know that's the answer.
So you've talked about a lot about the food system, right? And so there's a study last year in the US, and you've talked about this, which is the produce that we produce is 90% of the produce that comes out of the ground is actually used in the food system to make things that we buy, which is just bonkers. We should be eating that, right?
And sure. So 90% of the food that comes out of the ground is processed in some way.
Yeah, exactly.
But the vast majority is processed by feeding it to a chicken or a cow.
Yeah, exactly. And that's ludicrous, right?
Yeah, or a pig.
And so what, if you were in government and if you were trying to change the food system, what legislation would you bring in?
Yeah, so I would dust off the National Food Strategy from 2021, which was led by your former colleague, Henry Dimbleby, and I would put that into full force as quickly as I could. So the National Food Strategy 2021 gave a vision for a healthier Britain, a healthier food system that would make us healthier, help us to meet our global carbon emission commitments, and would reduce the burden of chronic disease in the UK substantially. It said that by 2032, the UK should have a food system, and I can't quite remember the exact numbers, but it was, I think, 25 to 30% more fruits and vegetables, 30% more dietary fibre for a gastroenterologist. I remember reading it there and going, yes, fibre! Absolutely, yes, more fibre. And it talked about reducing high-fat, high-sugar foods by about 25% and reducing meat consumption in the UK by about 30%. You could fact-check those figures, but they're roughly correct, I believe. They wanted a food system that would deliver that by 2032. It mapped out exactly what we needed to do. It talked about education in schools. It talked about incentives for the food industry. It talked about helping farmers to transition to other systems that are not necessarily producing meat and dairy. Of course, there's systems like that across the European Union right now, where farmers are being paid to move away from meat and dairy for sustainability and health reasons. So I would dust off that report, and I would implement it in its full force. At the time that it was published, Jamie Oliver, who had commented on it, said that this was a moment of great opportunity. He calls for brave leadership to transform the UK food system. The UK government, the Conservative government at the time, dropped the report, I think the day it was published, the day before it was published, and said, no, we are not doing that. And a few months later, they published a new food strategy for the UK, which was described by Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall as basically maintaining the food industry's status quo. And had a few weak measures in it. Sugar tax was in there, I believe, and a few other things that actually made it quite easy for the food industry to just flex a little bit. But the kind of transformative changes that we needed were just put aside.
So Henry and I wrote something called the School Food Plan in 2012. So, we were commissioned in 2012 by Michael Gove, who was having a row with Jamie Oliver. He asked Henry and me to write the school food plan. I think we did an okay job. and it resulted in free school meals for all infants. And that was brilliant because it made the whole system economic. We started out as fascists because we were friends with Michael Gove. And when we recommended free school meals, because that was the answer, we were communists. So I went from fascist to communist in 12 months, which was good. But what I would say is we were very conscious in that report. I remember I was asked, do you want it to be an official government report, which is not independent but signed off beforehand? Or do you want it to be an independent report where you have to recommend it to the government and they respond? Now, what do you do if you're given two choices? Third option. I said neither. Right, and this is just, first of all, I love Henry. I think he did an amazing job with the National Food Strategy. But as you're talking, I remember I went for a third option. I recommended it, which was independent report, but which is also signed off before you publish it. And I think that if I were to say anything, it would be if anyone's going to write a report for government, go for this third option, which is it's independent, but you get all the agreements signed off before you publish it. And my point is that 99% of reports are commissioned by a different politician from the one that is going to review it. And the incentive for that new politician to adopt the report commissioned by the first politician, even within the same party, is next to zero. So I think that hats off to Henry. I think it's an amazing thing that he did in that National Food Strategy. And his company Bramble that he's got now is set to try and raise money to transform the food industry. And I wish Henry, as my brother, or he's not actually my brother, but as my friend, my brother, and my co-founder of Leon, I wish him well. But even more than Henry, or just as much as Henry, I'd like you to give a round of applause for Alan, please.
Thank you so much.
I mean, what a gracious man to sit here and take my questions as a layman and not say, shut the fuck up, you idiot.
It's been great fun. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for coming. I really appreciate it.
Your book, what your doctor isn't telling you about your food, you heard it here. If you buy that book, Alan has promised you, and you heard him tell you, he's promised you a happy ending. So I can just wish you well. And again, say, Alan, I hope we're friends. You're an amazing man.
Oh, thank you. Lovely to meet you.
Well done.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.